So thank you for joining at the Deerfield Public Library for Understanding Russia's Invasion of Ukraine. The registration numbers for this program reflects the concern the public has for this matter, so thank you. I want to extend a big thanks to Gary Midkiff, who very quickly set to work on this program after we reached out to him just 2 weeks ago. Gary is a foreign policy analyst and college professor at North Park University, where he teaches business strategy and ethics. Gary leads the Great Decisions discussion group at the Deerfield Public Library. This is a large group tonight, so Gary will try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the program. Those questions can go into the chat. This program is being recorded, and that link will be sent out in the next few days. And we greatly appreciate all of your support of the Deerfield Public Library and our programs. So thank you for joining us tonight. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Gary.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight for this program. My target is to complete the program a few minutes before 8 o'clock and then go into the chat and respond to as many of your questions as I possibly can. I will not be stopping my presentation for either a raised hand or for a chat comment while I'm doing the presentation, but at the end I will do my very best to respond to chats that are there. Yesterday, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky made a virtual presentation to the US Congress. And I'm going to read to you some of the things that he said, and that's going to be my way of introduction. It then feeds into the points that I wish to make during the program. But in case you did not have a chance to either listen to his presentation or read the full transcript, which is available on the New York Times website, the Washington Post website, I did want you to hear some of the things that he said. So the following words are all from Zelensky, and then I'll let you know when I'm done reading his words. I'm proud to greet you from Ukraine, from our capital city of Kiev, a city that is under missile and airstrikes from Russian troops every day, but it doesn't give up. I have the honor to greet you on behalf of the Ukrainian people, brave and freedom-loving people who for 8 years have been resisting the Russian aggression, those who give their best sons and daughters to stop this full-scale Russian invasion. Right now, the destiny of our country is being decided, the destiny of our people, whether Ukrainians will be free, whether they will be able to preserve their democracy. Russia threw tanks and planes against our freedom, against our right to live freely in our own country, choosing our own future against our desire for happiness. I remember your national memorial in Rushmore, the faces of your prominent presidents, those who laid the foundation of the United States of America as it is today. Democracy, independence, freedom and care for everyone, for every person, for everyone who works diligently, who lives honestly, who respects the law. We in Ukraine want the same for our people. Remember Pearl Harbor, the terrible morning of December 7, 1941, when your sky was black from the planes attacking you. Just remember it. Remember September 11th, a terrible day in 2001, when evil tried to turn your cities, independent territories into battlefields, when innocent people were attacked from air. Our country experiences the same every day, right now, at this moment, every night for 3 weeks now. This is a terror that Europe has not seen for 80 years. And we are asking for a reply, for an answer to this terror from the whole world. Is this a lot to ask for, to create a no-fly zone over Ukraine to save people? I am grateful to President Biden for his personal involvement, for his sincere commitment to the defense of Ukraine and democracy all over the world. However, now it is true in the darkest time for our country, for the whole Europe, I call on you to do more. And in the end, to sum it up, today it is not enough to be the leader of the free world. Today, being the leader means to be the leader of peace. Today, the Ukrainian people are defending not only Ukraine, we are fighting for the values of Europe and the world, sacrificing our lives in the name of the future. Now I'm almost 45 years old. Today, my age stopped when the heart of more than 100 children stopped beating. I see no sense in life. It cannot stop the deaths. And this is my main mission as the leader of my people, brave Ukrainians, and as the leader of my nation. I'm addressing President Biden. You are the leader of the nation, of your great nation. I wish you to be the leader of the world. Being the leader of the world means to be the leader of peace. End of President Zelensky's comments. These are emotional words spoken by a person who has become the personification of leadership. And the words also create a moral dilemma for us. Is the U.S. doing enough? Should it be doing more? Is it doing the right thing? And I don't pretend to be smart enough to be able to definitively answer that, but I will point us in a couple of directions, and I will make a few suggestions about what we might do. We should not be in this place. We should not be in a position where we are watching the 41 or so million people of Ukraine, although 3 million of them have left the country, we believe, the 41 million people of Ukraine being bombed into oblivion. We should not be in this place. Our foreign policy mistakes regarding Ukraine go back 30 years across the administration of 6 presidents, starting with George H.W. Bush and extending through Joe Biden. All of those presidents have a hand in the situation that we now see in Ukraine. Those of you who know me know that I am a political centrist, and this is not a political presentation. We're not going to blame the folks on the left or the folks on the right. We're going to say our foreign policy has not done all it should be able to do. And I'll give you some examples. And then at the end, we'll see when you reflect on my words if you agree with me or not. H.W. Bush told Russia, as Gorbachev was the leader, that NATO would not extend any further towards the West. It would not go any closer to the Russian border. And then the United States broke his promise, putting pressure on Russia. Bill Clinton became friends with Boris Yeltsin, but then Yeltsin kind of succumbed to his desire for alcohol and was pushed out of office. And Clinton, in the last 2 years of his administration, was interested more in other things like not being kicked out of office than in terms of working with the Soviet Union or the countries that had been part of the Soviet Union, now called the Russian Federation. George Bush, after 9/11, accepted a visit from Vladimir Putin down at the ranch in Texas. Putin pledged support, which was appreciated after 9/11. And Bush famously said, "I looked into his eyes and saw his soul." Bush never reported exactly what he saw, but given the actions we've seen recently, perhaps what he saw was not worth reporting on. Barack Obama drew a red line in Syria and then didn't enforce it, and then allowed Putin to take the initiative of what was scheduled to be done. And when Ukraine, after their revolution of dignity, asked us for weapons to further strengthen their military, he did not allow that to take place. Donald Trump sent arms for Ukraine in the first 2 years of his administration, but then in the second 2 years, he held back. He was involved in a quid pro quo discussion, and that was more important to him than sending arms to Ukraine. Biden has placed tentative sanctions, and I'll define what I mean by tentative sanctions a bit later. And we have not allowed NATO planes to be used for a no-fly zone. Collectively, we could have and should have done better. We need to go back 2,000 years to understand where we are today. If we go back 2,000 years, we go back to Sun Tzu and his amazing book, The Art of War. Jamie mentioned that I teach business strategy at North Park. In fact, I have that class is running right now. And the students are required to read The Art of War and to discuss it every week. Invariably, when they start the class, they go, why do we have to read this thing? And at the end of the class, they invariably tell me, now I know why you had us read it. It is the single greatest book on strategy, not just military, business strategy, military strategy, to a degree, personal strategy that I think's ever been written. And if you've not read The Art of War, maybe you should consider putting it on your reading list. The quotation that I want to reference from Sun Tzu is when he said, to know your enemy, you must become your enemy. And what that means is to know your enemy, and in this case, the enemy is Vladimir Putin, not necessarily Russia, by the way, but Vladimir Putin. So to know your enemy, you must become your enemy, which is look at the world the way that Vladimir Putin does. It is a very different worldview than we have. And one of the mistakes that has affected those administrations that I talked about was assuming that Putin looked at the world the way that we do. He does not. That he had the same thought processes, the same belief in representative government, working with other nations. He does not. I am not blaming him. I'm trying to describe him. He has no moral core. That is obvious. Where we're trying to understand him. To do that, we need to become him. And I will give you some examples from a document that he wrote a few years ago about how we might do that. Having gone back 2,000 years, we then need to go back 80 years to Winston Churchill. When Winston Churchill, at the just early part of World War II, made the following statement, partly in response to Neville Chamberlain, of course, quote, each one hopes that if he feeds the crocodile enough, the crocodile will eat him last. All of them hope that the storm will pass before their turn comes to be devoured. He was talking about Hitler specifically, but we need to look at that quotation in terms of Putin. Also, we could apply it to Xi Jinping, but China's not part of this lecture. So if we apply it to Putin, then it says, if we appease and appease and appease, it will be to our detriment. At some point, there needs to be a statement that says no further, or we will respond. At the moment, we have not reached that point. I think we need to, and at the end of the program, I will explain what I mean by that. Then we need to go back 31 years to the end of the Soviet Union. Then we need to go back 23 years to Putin's amazing Millennium Manifesto that he published just before the year 2000. Historians like me will point to Hitler's Mein Kampf, where Hitler outlined, in essence, what he planned to do when he came to power. Putin was in power in 1999, and he outlined exactly what he planned to do, and we didn't listen. We dismissed it as political talk for his internal audience. It was not. He laid out what was important to him and what he planned to do, and he's consistently acted on that. We should not be surprised. Rather, we should look at ourselves and go, why didn't we pay more attention to what he said? Then we need to survey the last 2 decades. What did Putin do? And what did Putin perceive about us? And when I say us, and I'll use this term during the program, us refers to Western liberal democracies. It refers to the US. It refers to NATO. It refers to the EU. That's kind of the collective us. So when I say that, that's what I'm referring to. And then we need to look at the last 2 decades one more time in terms of what did we do or what did we not do? That becomes important as well. So Sun Tzu, know your enemy. To know your enemy, you must become your enemy. Sun Tzu was all about winning without having to fight. He was a military genius and a military leader in a number of battles, but he always said that the greatest general is the one who can manipulate a situation so he doesn't have to fight. He doesn't have to put his troops at risk. And Sun Tzu goes into a great deal of doing that. But to be able to do that, you have to know your enemy. Sun Tzu says that it's more important to understand your enemy than yourself. We actually have a parallel in American history. Robert E. Lee, the famous Confederate general, was known for saying up until he fought U.S. Grant, because he fought 10 Union generals before that, he was famous for saying, I understood how they think. I understood what they were going to do, and it made it easier for me to defeat them. It's not until he faces U.S. Grant where he says, I really don't understand what it is that he's going to do next. And Grant's the one who defeats Lee and makes him surrender at Appomattox. So that becomes a really important concept to think about. We didn't understand Putin. We put our thoughts, our values, and our perceptions on our image of him, and it proved to be incorrect, even though the signs were there. Churchill's comment about the crocodile. It is a sad fact relating to foreign policy and international relations that you need to do something that Stanley McChrystal, the former U.S. general who's now retired, McChrystal phrased it beautifully in an interview that he did, and he was talking about Sparta from the Peloponnesian Wars. And he said the purpose of the Spartan military was to give credibility to Spartan diplomacy. And the purpose of Spartan diplomacy was to not have to use the Spartan military. So it's a circle. It's a circle that balances. And Sparta understood that. And when they defeated Athens in the Peloponnesian War, they did that. We have to understand that too. It is not enough for us, and again, remember, us is kind of a large definition. It is not enough for us to say, well, we don't want to escalate, and we don't want to risk this, and we don't want to risk that, because if you summarize all of those comments together, we are backing up. And at some point, there's no further place to back up to. So if that's the case, that's not a good strategy for us to follow. Then we need to go back 31 years to the end of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed. Gorbachev was there when it collapsed. The reasons for it collapse are not part of this lecture, but it collapsed. The individual component countries of the Soviet Union suddenly had their freedom. Some have been reabsorbed in the Russian Federation, but some were given their freedom, including the one which is Ukraine, which is kind of the subject for our discussion this evening. We saw it as the ultimate triumph of Western liberal democracy. The big bad Soviet bear is dead. Francis Fukuyama, who's a really smart guy, is a political science professor at a couple different universities, made the incredibly incorrect statement that we have reached the end of history. And what he meant by that was it's been the liberal West against the Soviet Union, and now that no longer exists, so everyone can get along in the world. That was 1991 that Fukuyama said that. Well, that didn't work out that way. And why did it not work out that way? Because even though the Soviet Union ended, the desires of the leadership of the Soviet Union pretty much continued. We didn't perceive that. We thought that everyone would get along together now, and that elective government was going to triumph around the world. If you look around the world right now, you'll notice that of the 194 nations in the world or so, a minority of them have a truly representative government. The majority are led by autocracies, dictatorships, etc. So I wouldn't exactly say that we've reached the end of history. Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin were the original odd couple. They formed a friendship. We helped Yeltsin get reelected in 1996. By the way, we actually interfered in the Russian election, which is kind of bizarre given what we've read in the media during the last 6 years or so. But we actually helped him do that. And Yeltsin got elected, and that was fine. But Yeltsin also was not capable of maintaining leadership. He became frustrated. He started acting in an authoritarian manner. His health started to go down, and he realized that he was not going to be able to continue in leadership. So he selected Vladimir Putin to take over leadership of the country. Now, yes, Russia has elections, but we all know that they're not free and fair. So there's elections, but they don't really mean much. So Yeltsin appointed Putin to take over from Yeltsin, which Putin did. Hold on that, because we're going to come back to Putin a lot when we get back to the manifesto. George Bush comes into his presidency. 9/11 happens literally 8 months after he's sworn into office, and almost all of his presidency is hijacked by 9/11 or his responses to 9/11, going to Afghanistan, going to Iraq, the war on terror, etc. Putin comes over and pledges support, which, by the way, Russia did do, to go after some terrorist networks, which assisted Russia as well. But Bush didn't pay any attention to Ukraine and not really any attention to Russia. Then we have Barack Obama, who became president, and he said, we want to pivot to Asia. Well, pivot is the wrong verb. Pay more attention to Asia, yes, but we should never, ever have taken our eye off of Russia. And the pinch point there becomes Syria. We drew a line in the sand in terms of the use by Bashar al-Assad of weapons, of chemical weapons. And when he used them, we didn't act, and we turned over responsibility to Putin, who then became essentially friends with Assad, who gave him a port on the Mediterranean, and now they are now good friends. By the way, there are Syrian soldiers fighting with the Russian soldiers in Ukraine now. Their relationship is very firm. Obama didn't make much progress on that. Trump sent arms, good, during the first 2 years. He didn't commit American troops, good. Ukraine's not a NATO member. He sent arms, but then the last 2 years, he became kind of involved in what did the Bidens do in Ukraine and trying to leverage Zelensky in terms of helping him with that, and lost the focus. Biden comes into office, and Biden has been hesitant. We'll talk about Biden in more detail. Biden is doing more and more, but Biden has been hesitant. So if you look at all of this from the perspective of Ukraine, okay, Ukraine became an independent country in 1991, and what sort of support have they received from the US? None, inconsistent, or inadequate overall. They've gone through a couple of revolutions. They kicked out a dictator. They had the Orange Revolution. They had the Revolution of Dignity. They have become a representative government that actually had a free and fair election when they selected their current president, which is not that easy to do. They've been making progress, but they've been making it to a degree on their own. They have a strong sense of nationalism, and we can see that in the actions that they are doing now. Now we need to go back 23 years to Vladimir Putin's amazing Millennium Manifesto, where Putin lays out his view of the world, his view of Russia's position in the world, his description of the character of the Russian people. And it is available, by the way, you can get to it on the internet. It's about 50 pages or so long if you choose to print it. But it's an amazing document. Now, we all know that politicians produce spin. And spin can be verbal spin, it can be printed spin. It is, I want to take the facts and I want to change them around to make me look good or to impress a domestic audience. We know that. This was not spin. This was a well-crafted document that explained what it is that Putin wanted to do. Examples of things that he said. He said that the end of the Soviet Union was the worst catastrophe in Russian history, the end of the Soviet Union. He said because of the family relationship between Russians in the diaspora, or Russians in what's called the Great Abroad, then it is the worst thing that could have happened to Russia or the Russian people who are now outside the borders. Now, we said it's the end of history, Fukuyama. It's the end of history. We have triumphed. But from Putin's perspective, it's the greatest catastrophe. And he specifically says, we, the Russian country, the Russian people, need to work to overcome that catastrophe, to negate it, to mitigate it, to overcome it, to try to put the Soviet Union back together again. He doesn't say that in exact phrase, but that's clearly what he implies by what he writes, to bring the Soviet Union back together again. We are in the West going, we've won. It's over. Cold War is over. And Putin is going, no, we have to put that back together again. It's in our national heritage. He doesn't use the phrase, it's in our national DNA, but that's what you derive from it when you read the document itself. First and foremost, Putin writes, it's worth acknowledging the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. For the Russian people, it's a genuine tragedy. Tens of millions of our fellow citizens and countrymen found themselves beyond the fringes of Russian territory. He goes on to say that Russia will never be a Western democracy. He means representative government, but he says democracy. He says Russians want a strong leader. They've wanted a strong leader for hundreds of years. So he's going back into Tsarist history now. That's what we want. That's what we demand. And we need a strong leader. It is worth noting that in the year 2000, you may recall, a number of nations around the world went through this contest where they said, okay, who is the greatest person in our country in the last 100 years, 1900 to 2000? Who's the greatest person? Great Britain chose Winston Churchill, big surprise. Who'd Russia choose? Joseph Stalin. Why did they choose someone who murdered more people than Hitler? Because he was a strong leader. And it is Putin's belief that the Russian population want a strong leader. And he obviously was saying, by the way, here I am, and I'm going to be the strong leader that you need. He emphasizes in his document, his Millennium Manifesto, Russia's unique place in civilization and its special geographic position in the world. Russia, by the way, is the largest country in the world, square miles, not population, but square miles. Yes, a lot of it is up in Siberia and it's permafrost and stuff, but it is the largest nation in the world by far. And Putin talks about that. And he says the Soviet Union needs to go through a rebirth. And there are schools of thought that say that is not a good idea, but we need to pay attention, says Putin, to those 25 million Russians in the diaspora. Russians living in Poland, Russians living in Belarus, Russians living in Ukraine. We owe it to them to bring them back into the family. It shouldn't be a surprise that he leveraged Belarus, which is now essentially a puppet government for him, or Ukraine. He believes that is his mission as a political leader to do that, for goodness sake. All of these practices create a narrative that says, this is where Russia needs to go. We made a stumble. It was a catastrophe, but we can recover from that. And he needs to rely, Putin says, on the patriotism of the Russian people. Now, the word translates as patriotism, and I don't read Russian, so I've been reading translations the whole time. But the word patriotism means something very different to the Russian people than it means to us. Russians are patriotic and willing to sacrifice for their country to a greater degree than the average American citizen. They have put up with invasions, they have put up with deprivation, and they continue to soldier on, which is probably an appropriate phrase for Russia, and they still are willing to sacrifice for their country in ways that I don't think the citizens of the United States on whole are willing to do. There's a strong patriotic current inside the Russian population. And Putin says that we are going to build on that because that is something we need to use to help recreate the Soviet Union. He calls it a pride in one's country, history, and accomplishments. I could argue that accomplishments under the Soviet Union weren't so great, but I can't really argue the country in terms of its historical value, those sorts of things. I can't really argue against that. He also says that Russia is a great power, will remain a great power, and will become a greater power in the future. Now, every foreign policy analyst that I've read or listened to says that it is unlikely that Russia will be able to accomplish that. It has to do with demographics. It has to do with the age of the population, the fact that they have a terrible alcohol problem in the country, et cetera. But the point is, we're staying within Putin's manifesto. And Putin in his manifesto says it will be a great power, and it will be because in part of the characteristics of its people and culture. In other words, he is saying that not only are Russian people patriotic, but that will be a building block, using a different term, for the greatness of Russia as it expresses itself. Well, no nation that calls itself great typically stays within its borders. It finds reasons to go outside of its borders, which he has certainly done, and we'll catalog those things he has done in just a few minutes. He also talks about the social solidarity of the Russian people. Now, that's a bit surprising because there are a number of ethnic groups inside of Russia, but he talks about social solidarity. And he says, it's a fact that we have always striven for cooperative forms of activity and prevailed over individualism. Paternalistic sentiments have struck deep roots in Russian history. The majority of Russians are used to connecting improvements in their own conditions more with the aid and support of the state than by their own efforts. In other words, individualism, entrepreneurship aren't important in Putin's view of the Russian people. It is, we are going to act as a collective. And I use the word collective, and I'm now using a Stalinistic term. But that is what he has told the Russian people, and apparently what he firmly believes. Unity, focus together, one nation, and we have a strong sense of nationhood and of doing the right thing for the nation, and it's more important than us as individuals. That is a strong series of statements. And since Putin has been in power, and by the way, technically he wasn't in power when Medvedev was president for 4 years, but Putin was really in power. So Putin's been in power since 1999. And given the changes in the Constitution that he has rammed through, he's going to be in power for a while. By the way, Putin is 70 years old this year. And although I'm not a person to criticize someone who's 70 years old, since I'm past that myself, there's a question about how long he's going to have enough energy and such to lead a nation of that nature. That's pretty much a full-time job. But his vision is that it is him. And like most dictators, and Putin is a dictator, like most dictators, he doesn't really have a clearly defined number two. Because if you clearly define a number two, then you set up someone who may be combating with you to lead the country. So Russia doesn't have a number two. They may have a number two in title. They don't have a number two in terms of leading the country. Putin told us where he wanted to go: recreate the Soviet Union, which means grab a number of countries. He may not be able to afford it because his economy is not that good, but he certainly wants political control, political leverage, and he wants buffers between him and the nations of the West, and that means NATO. Okay, hold on to the amazing Millennium Manifesto, and let's go to another point. We need to survey the last 2 decades. What did Putin do? Let's go through just a small list of the things that Putin has done since he's been in power. And now we're talking about military escapades. 1999, he invaded Dagestan, which is in the Caucasus. It was the start of the Second Chechenian War. 2000, he invades Chechnya for the Second War and fights Chechnya for a few years. 2008, he invades Georgia and South Ossetia. 2009, he goes into the North Caucasus, supposedly to root out Islamist terrorists. Interesting, he was there for 8 years fighting. I guess there were a lot of Islamist terrorists there. They had to fight. 2014, he takes the Crimea because he's concerned about the direction that Ukraine is going. Later in 2014, he takes the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine. That's Luhansk and Donetsk, which are those two breakaway states in the eastern end of the country. He is still there. 2015, he involves himself in Syria. 2018, he goes into the Central African Republic, disrupts the election so that the person who will win the election is someone who says it's important to have relationships with Russia. So that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That is 7 military adventures since 1999. And in each of those, he has gone into a sovereign nation and taken control in one form or another. What has been the response of the West? Nothing. We have done the terrible thing that I sometimes use when I'm criticizing politicians in general. We have pointed with alarm. We have said, oh, that's not good. We, the West, have said, oh, you're breaking international norms. But what exactly did Putin suffer as a consequence? I mean, he lost some soldiers. I understand that. He spent a few dollars. I understand that. But what did he get in terms of international condemnation, even after he took Crimea and took the Donbas region? We said we're going to level sanctions. They were piddly, and they didn't change his behavior at all. So what sort of perception does he form about us, given the fact that he's done all of these things and we haven't done anything in response? He believes that there is weakness and disunity in the West. There's NATO. What have they done? No, he didn't attack a NATO country. That's true. But NATO hasn't risen up to say, hey, we want to defend democracy. What has the US done? Not anything terribly meaningful. Where's the consequence? Where's the penalty? I don't see one. So this year, he invades Ukraine. Now, we don't know how that's going to turn out. And I'm sure that you, like me, are following the news reports on a daily basis. And we don't know. We have hopes, but we don't know. But what we're talking about now is his invasion of Ukraine and how we came to decide to do it. Well, now, given the information that I just covered, it's becoming fairly clear. He regards Ukraine as part of the Soviet Union. He knows that many people in Ukraine are of Russian heritage and or speak Russian. He believes that the West is not united and is not willing to stand up to him. And therefore, that's a country there for taking. He didn't have to attack Belarus because he was able to co-opt the dictator who's in that country. You may recall a few weeks ago when the invasion started that about 1/3 of the troops that invaded Ukraine came through Belarus from the north. The Belarusian border is closer to Kiev than the eastern or southern borders that the Russian troops came in also. Didn't have to do it there because he's got a puppet state there. There's no reason we should have been surprised. And when we spend time saying that we've sent Secretary of State Antony Blinken to negotiate, to follow the route of diplomacy, it is fairly clear that we wasted our time because he already had made the decision and he has acted on the decision, and we shouldn't be surprised by that. We have started to do responses, make responses during the last 2 months or so. And that's a good thing, but we should have already known this. A couple of people who are in some of my great decisions groups, as a matter of fact, 1 or 2 of them might be in the programs, and I can't see you guys, as you know, when we do this version of a Zoom program, pointed out to me that what we should have been doing going back a few years, which is going back through Biden, through Trump, back into Obama, once they had the revolution of dignity, once they said, we want to be a democracy, we want to move towards the West, is start sending them arms, as many as we could, to strengthen their military. Their military turns out to be pretty feisty, by the way. I believe Russia is surprised by how feisty it's been. But the point that they made to me was we should have been sending arms the entire time. By the way, the United States is the #1 international seller of military weapons. We're #1. You can argue that's good or bad, but the point is that we have the capability to make those weapons, and we certainly have the willingness in Washington, D.C. to spend money on those weapons. We should have been doing that on a regular basis. Diplomacy works if there are shared values and common interests. Then you've got a chance for diplomacy. But if you don't have shared values and you don't have common interests, then diplomacy is pretty much a waste of time. You can say to yourself, well, I tried to talk through it. Well, without those two things being present, it's going to be difficult to have it take effect. So here we are. Here we are today, and the war is continuing. So let's do an assessment of where we are today, given the fact that we shouldn't be surprised that we are where we are today. Number one, sanctions have been tentatively applied and NATO is not unanimous. Those of you with a financial background know that the strongest thing the US could have done was to remove Russia from SWIFT, SWIFT, which is the protocol and the computer programs that allow funds to be transferred internationally. That would have even more so crippled the Russian economy. We didn't do that. Why didn't we do that? It turns out that there are two countries in the EU, specifically Germany and Italy, who said, oh my goodness, that's going to cause our countries significant difficulties because then we can't transact with Russian fossil fuels, which we need in our country. So we couldn't do that. And even now, we've only done partial sanctions through SWIFT because the energy sector is thus far been carved out. We know the sanctions are having impact on Russia. We can see it in the value of the ruble, the fact that they're closing factories, not making payrolls. We can see that. But the point is, it hasn't deterred Russian behavior. What's the point of sanctions if it's not going to change behavior? If all we want to do is punish them, remember, this is a population which is very patriotic, which very much supports Russia and the goals that Russia has. So we have to, buckle up and get through this because we're protecting Mother Russia. I have to think that Putin calculated that there would be sanctions. He shouldn't be surprised. And thus far, he is working through them. Is there pain? Yes, but there's no change in behavior, at least not yet. We need to remember that Putin's behavior is abhorrent, but it's not insane. It's kind of looking at Kim Jong-un, who, by the way, has lost a lot of weight. I saw a picture of him that it was like, wow, it looks like a body double almost. But in any case, Kim Jong-un, we thought, was unstable and mentally unstable a few years ago. When he's not mentally unstable at all. He just has a way of looking at the world, and he has goals that are inconsistent with ours. So we need to remind ourselves for Putin that he's not insane. He doesn't have Parkinson's. I saw that on some weird newscast recently. He doesn't have that. He simply has a focus that's different than ours. He is obsessed with putting the Soviet Union back together. He's obsessed with the threat from NATO, which was formed as a defensive alliance, not an offensive alliance. He is obsessed with that. And he will not stop his behavior until we stop him. Now, that may sound a little harsh, but if all we do is say, well, we can't send those MiGs over from Poland because Putin tells us that's going to be an escalation, excuse me, isn't the invasion of Ukraine an escalation in and of itself? Isn't the bombing of a maternity hospital an escalation? Isn't the destruction of churches an escalation? Isn't just a wholesale bombing of neighborhoods an escalation? So we have to be careful in terms of the words we hear versus the actions we see. It's better if we look at actions and interpret those, although we shouldn't be surprised by what's going on. The one place I think that Putin has been surprised is the fact that the Russian army is not invincible. They did not overrun Ukraine in a few days. The strength of the Ukrainian resistance, and if you choose to go on to YouTube, you can watch hours of these videos, in terms of the sabotage, the various ways that Russian tanks have been isolated and attacked, the missiles which we gave Ukraine, which are called shoulder-mounted missiles, which are able to take down helicopters and some low-flying planes, have been incredibly effective. And the Russian movement has been reduced as an effect, at terrible cost, by the way. But I do think that that was a miscalculation. I'm sure Putin knew sanctions were coming, but he's surprised by that. Where will that lead? I don't know. I don't see the future, and I don't know. So what calculation is he going to make? Don't know. Am I concerned about nuclear war? No. And I'm not concerned about that for the same reason that I've never been concerned about it, which is if he can kill us 5 times and we can kill him 4 times, there is no benefit in nuclear war. Could there be tactical nuclear weapons? Yes, and there is such a thing, by the way, as a tactical nuclear weapon. It's a weapon that doesn't take out the city of Chicago. It just takes out, like a few square miles. They do exist. We have them too. NATO has them, although I'm not aware there are any tactical nukes that are close to Ukraine, but we have them in Europe, we have them in NATO countries, and they're not that far away. Could that happen? Maybe. But the problem with nuclear weapons is that the destructive power that the other side can do to us, we can do to them. And in the end, no one wins. It's kind of like the end of Dr. Strangelove, which, by the way, is still a very funny movie if you like humor of that nature, where at the very end, everything is blowing up because everyone's unleashed all of the bombs and the world's going to end. A sane person would not allow a nuclear strike. Putin is not insane. He is not going to do that. So I'm not concerned about that. If our goal is avoiding World War III, and sadly our administration has said that a few times recently, we don't want to have World War III. Well, no one wants World War III. But go back to the comment I made about appeasement. If all we do is back up and back up and back up and back up, eventually there's nowhere further to go. And then the crocodile comes out, and then that's not good. So is it calling the nuclear bluff? No. It is simply saying, you're not going to do that. We know you're not going to do that. And if you do, we're going to respond, and you don't want that. So it's not going to take place. Given all of that, what should we do? The war is continuing. I checked the headlines just before this program started. The war is continuing. So what do we do now? I've got a couple of ideas. One, we need to maximize all available sanctions immediately. Yes, the cost of energy will be more expensive in Europe. Yes, our costs at the gasoline pump will probably go up, although please keep in mind that the increase in cost at the pumps is not exclusively caused by the war in Ukraine, so don't fall for that fake news. Partially, but not completely. So we need to maximize sanctions on the assumption that sanctions can change behavior, and I'm not sure that they can. We need to maximize them now. A gradual application makes no sense because the war is continuing, and Ukraine probably can't hold out forever. I mean, in my heart, I hope they do, but I don't think they can. So we need to maximize the sanctions. If they're going to change behavior, we need to maximize them. Number two, we need to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Now, a couple of retired military have pointed out to me in my great decisions discussions that isn't easy to do, that there is a risk, and I understand that. But establishing a no-fly zone would reduce the carnage that we see in Ukrainian cities. And it can be phrased in such a way that we're not attacking Russian troops. We, the West, NATO, the US, we are establishing a no-fly zone for the safety of the Ukrainian people. May or may not be accepted. I think it's worth the effort. Number three, we need to absolutely maximize military aid with the stuff that Ukraine needs, which include anti-tank weapons and anti-aircraft weapons, shoulder-mounted stuff. And whether it comes through Poland or it comes through us or it comes from another NATO country, we need to do that now. We are not responsible for the future of Ukraine. There is no connection historically between those people and us. But we are responsible in part for the following reason. If we are a world leader, and I believe we are, not the world leader, but a world leader. If we are a world leader, and this gets back to something that Zelensky said in his speech that I read to you, let me go back and quote it. President Biden, you are the leader of the nation. I wish you to be the leader of the world. Being the leader of the world means to be the leader of peace. Achieving peace in this case means to balance the military so that the negotiating table makes sense. Von Clausewitz, the famous military theoretician from Germany from the 19th century, wrote that, and he said that the only way that negotiations can take place is when there is a military stalemate, then negotiations become a reasonable alternative. Or you can go back to the Stanley McChrystal quote that I gave earlier. But we have to establish that with decisive leadership that says, here is a degree to which we will support Ukraine. Otherwise, we will enable Russia if we do less than that. Russia will go, well, it's kind of painful for a little while. The ruble went down and lost a few soldiers, but we got some conscripts that are okay. And where shall we go next? Yeah. I do not want that to happen. So this isn't Armageddon. This isn't an absolute last stand sort of thing, but it is a place for us to exercise leadership. And I hope we do more than we have before. I'm happy that the US Congress stood up and applauded. I'm happy that so many of them wore yellow and blue when they went and listened to him speak. But that is cheap. That's what I call virtue signaling. That's like me standing or sitting, which I'm doing, in front of you and saying, I stand with the people of Ukraine. What does that mean? I'm not going there. I'm not fighting there. What does it mean I'm standing with them? Well, my country can stand with them by doing those things that I mentioned. Maximum sanctions immediately, a no-fly zone with our NATO partners, and absolute maximum military aid of the type that Ukraine needs. And then we might be able to help Ukraine maintain their sovereignty. I hope that will be the case. I can't see the future and I don't know, but I hope that will be the case. This is our moment to provide leadership, and I hope that President Biden does so. It is 7:53, and I targeted to end around 7:50, so I guess I was a little verbose there because I went 3 minutes over to 7:53. I see 14 comments in the chat, and what I'm going to do is open up the chat, and then I will go from the first comment through. Those people that ask questions, I will try to respond to. I will read a version of what the question is, and then we will go from there. So let me get my controls out here. Okay, now I'm in chat. Let me go to the beginning of chat. I'm not going to mention anyone's name because I don't want to embarrass you or single you out. I'll just say that there's a question about this or a question about that. Closed captioning's been turned on. Did President Reagan promise that Ukraine would not be a part of NATO? No, he did not. By the time the Soviet Union was starting to break up and Ukraine, remember, was part of the Soviet Union, George H.W. Bush was president, not Reagan, so Reagan didn't make that. Did Reagan also promise Russia a lot of economic help, which he did not get through Congress? As part, near the end of Reagan's second term in office, he wanted to be more active assisting the Soviet Union. Congress was not particularly willing to do that. No, he was not particularly helpful. We went into Iraq uninvited, unprovoked. Should President Bush be charged with war crimes? That's kind of off topic for what we're discussing tonight. But no, I do not think that President Bush should be charged with war crimes. I do not. Putin has put his foot down. He will not let us go any further. Ukraine is the starting point of Russia. Kiev was the capital of Russia. Historically, there is a great connection between Ukraine and Russia. There is no argument about that. But we in the world today believe in the sanctity of sovereign nations. And if you believe in the sanctity of sovereign nations who have the right of self-determination, even if they make stupid decisions, then you have to acknowledge that Ukraine was a sovereign nation created after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and they went on their own path. And they have a right to do that. And no nation has the right to invade them unless Ukraine had invaded them first and it was a defensive sort of thing. Ukraine didn't invade Russia, we know that. So no, Putin has put his foot down, that's true, but dictators and autocrats tend to do that. We need to put a foot down, not on his foot necessarily, but next to it. We fought a civil war to keep a union together. Putin's doing the same thing. Actually, we didn't. We fought a civil war to end slavery. We started with the concept that Lincoln said that in his interpretation of the Constitution, states aren't allowed to do that. But in the middle of the Civil War, when Lincoln produced the greatest moral document in U.S. history, which is the Emancipation Proclamation, the reason for the war switched over to we need to get slavery out of the Constitution and out of our country. We are the only nation in world history, the only one who fought a war to end slavery. Think about that for a minute. It gives you a different perspective, I think, on history. Okay, so we've got a comment from Jamie. Do you think Putin will resort to the nuclear option if his back is against the wall? No, and the reason I don't is because his generals, whatever their level of competence, fully understand what that would mean. So do the oligarchs who haven't sold off their yachts yet, fully understand what that would mean. And now there's going to be a whole lot of pressure internally that goes, this isn't a good idea. And if you want our support, this is not an option we're going to follow. That's where that would go. Yes, if his back's against the wall, if his army's losing Ukraine, they're being pushed out of the country, he's worried about his popularity or credibility inside of his country, might he become desperate? Yes. But that's where the people that are close to him, including Sergei Lavrov, his essentially foreign minister, are going to go, okay, this isn't a good decision and we can't support you. And that would change his behavior at that point. Thank you for the presentation. You're welcome. This is the sort of stuff I spend a lot of time on. And interestingly, a number of my senior living communities where I do programs for foreign policy have requested that I do this program for them face-to-face when I visit them in April. So I'll be doing that a number of times. Russia follows this preemptive strike script to protect Russians in East Ukraine. Yes, Russia absolutely does. Russia, remember, Putin said this back in the Millennium Manifesto. We have a responsibility to those 25 Russians who live outside the boundaries of the Soviet Union. We got to bring them back home. He's trying to do that in Ukraine. We can argue that that's a specious argument. But the point I made, and I hope that resonates with you, is he told us what he was going to do. So he is doing what he said he would do, for goodness sake. Manifest destiny is the inspiration behind every expansive empire. The phrase manifest destiny, which was invented by President James K. Polk, specifically said that God wants us to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Apparently, those Native Americans were important. So the phrase manifest destiny is very much a national thing for us, that phrase. But countries convince themselves that there's some sort of greater value, whether it's God spoke to me, which always makes me leery. God spoke to me, or we've got 25 million Russians outside our borders. We've got to protect them, etc. Countries find justifications for expansion. But the phrase manifest destiny, that's actually a James K. Polk thing. Can you define what is referred to specifically as the West? For the purpose of this presentation, I lumped together the EU, NATO, and the United States. So pretty much we're talking about Europe, the unaligned nations in the northern part of Europe, Great Britain, whatever category they're in, us, Canada. That's pretty much what I'm talking about when I say the West. Are we going to watch the murder of Zelensky on TV? I certainly hope not. For someone whose profession was being a comedian before he became president, I think that he has done an incredibly heroic job. And I hope later on we will get to compliment him when he comes to Washington for a visit as the representative of his country. If Putin is in favor of the Russians in general, why is he killing Ukrainians in numbers? Because the only way that he can get control of the country and save the true Russians is by killing the Ukrainians. Don't ask me to explain the logic, but that's what the reasoning would sound like. There's this awful parallel back to the Vietnam War, where an American officer, and you've heard this phrase, an American officer said, we had to destroy the village to save it. Well, pretty much that ridiculous logic could be applied to what Putin's doing. I've got to destroy Ukraine to save the Russians who are there. One could suggest that some Russians are going to be killed. It doesn't seem to be terribly important to Putin. Okay, answered your questions. Yeah, I'm glad. I didn't know I answered your question, but that's good. Can you explain how it's possible to establish a no-fly zone without risking a direct conflict with Russian aircraft? It is impossible. And now we're at 8 o'clock. So it's impossible to establish a no-fly zone without the possibility of contact with Russian aircraft. That's where the world community becomes important. If the world community says we need for humanitarian purposes to have a no-fly zone and supports the concept, then if there is, the Russian plane shot down, the Polish plane is shot down, which may very well happen, then world opinion will not be in support of Russia because it is, hey, we said no-fly zone for humanitarian purposes and you broke it. Is that a risk? Yes. And I'm going to suggest that from where I sit here in Buffalo Grove tonight, that is a risk worth taking. That's my opinion on that. Why not recommend anti-ship munitions to stop potential Southern attacks? Those are fine too. Whatever sorts of munitions we can send, anti-tank and anti-aircraft are particularly important, but those would certainly work as well. If we enforce a no-fly zone, wouldn't Russia launch nukes into the US? No. No, they will not. Nukes would be launched if we launch into them, which we're not going to do. If Putin is pushing a corner and he doesn't listen to his generals, that might happen. But no, the no-fly zone, if supported by world opinion and based on the comments on world leaders, that would seem to be a pretty popular idea these days. We just have to make it happen. I don't think that that would cause it. Implications of China-Russia alliance. This is very interesting because China has been surprisingly silent. They have not condemned Russia, but they've been very silent in terms of support. They did make a statement back around the Olympics. Xi Jinping made a statement that nations shouldn't violate the sovereignty of other nations. Well, Ukraine's a sovereign nation and Russia just violated it. So China is in a position where it's difficult for them on the objective side to show support for Russia. Jamie, it is now 8:02. I have not gone through all of the chat because people keep adding chat, but we've certainly gone through the full hours. So unless there's another question that you saw scanning through chat that I should respond to, I'm going to say we're at the end of the program. Jamie?
That's great. Thank you, Gary. This was really informative. And again, for those who joined us a little bit later, this program has been recorded. So I will be sending out the recording link to everyone once we have that available so you can revisit the beginning of the program. Thanks again, Gary, and good luck with your future programs. And we'll see you at Great Decisions.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you so much for signing on tonight. Thank you.